So welcome to the BBRO demo farm here at Morley. Big thanks to TMAF and David Jones for hosting us. On this site we have what we call our BBRO demo strips. Now many of you will be familiar that we do the RL trials, and they are highly replicated plots on a number of sites, usually about 8. But also to complement those sites where we gather a lot of detailed information, we like to do these demo strips as well, which involves drilling out maybe 4 or 6 drills right across the field of each of the varieties. I like this approach because it gives us some complementary information to the RL list. We can test slightly wider range of soil types, and sometimes we get situations when those strips come under pressure. On this site we've quite got a high weed pressure on the site, but also it allows us to sometimes take those strips a little bit later and do late harvesting, and I think that gives us some insight into how some of these newer varieties actually deal with the stresses. If we cast our minds back to 2023, we had beet moth, we had a frost, and actually how those varieties respond to those particular pressures, not forgetting the drought of course, and how they recover can be really important, particularly for those of you who like to do slightly later harvesting. So it allows us to have a look at those and draw that extra information. Now I would make the point very clearly, this is observational data, they're not replicated strips or anything, so we have to be careful of that, but it does allow us to infer some useful information about those varieties. Of course, all of you would have got Beet Review in May, which actually had the 24 RL list, and in there you've got the recommended list, but also you've got the 3 years data as well. So there's lots of information in there. I suspect many of you perhaps hadn't a real good look at it yet, but you will be thinking about those varieties in terms of your seed order, and more importantly where you're going to place those varieties and which fields on the farm later on. And as well as in Beet Review, of course, it's also available on the BBRO website, and actually you can go back and look at the previous information if you want to. Now, just a reminder, when you might have noticed when you looked at the list for 24, you might have been struck by the fact there were only 2 new additions to them, and actually some varieties which weren't on it anymore, and one of those ones is Cortessa, which was withdrawn by the breeder, a variety which you've been quite familiar with and used quite widely, I suspect. And obviously as we talk about the new varieties, you'll be thinking about what variety can I possibly replace Cortessa with. I would really encourage you, certainly in September right up to harvest, to go actually and look at your own varieties and do some very basic assessments on how they're performing in terms of perhaps how they're growing, in terms of their canopy vigour, how they may be dealing with various foliar diseases as well. Really important extra information to use in conjunction with the RL list. Now in the September edition of Beet Review, we'll give you a little chart and some examples on how to make some of those really simple assessments to help you categorise some of your varieties and how they perform on your farm. One of the properties which isn't included in the RL, but one which we have been looking at over the last few seasons, and you've probably heard us talk about before, is growth habit. If you look at a typical variety, so this is this is 1915, which many of you grow, you can see has a large number of petioles, probably over 20 on this example here, and can you see how they're all very upright? So this is what we call an upright, vigorous variety. If we contrast that with another variety, so you can see it's probably got fewer, shorter petioles, but can you see how much more spreading it is? And we call this tend to be more of a prostrate variety. Many of those lower leaves will actually be in contact in the ground. Now, whilst we don't measure the significance of this in the RL trials, there has been some ongoing work at Nottingham University. Lucy Tillier did her PhD looking at these and reached some quite nice conclusions. And for example, when you've got a nice prostrate variety with the leaves out there, they are much more effective in capturing the sunlight in May and June. And if you think the logic of that, the sun is more overhead and coming down. So that has been shown in Lucy's work. Some of our other work has also shown, again, sometimes on very weedy sites, that this prostrate low growing habit, obviously we get canopy closure earlier in the season, and sometimes it can suppress, not control, but suppress weed growth as well. So there's some agronomic significance of that growth habit. If we go back to the tall upright one again remembering what I was saying about capturing sunlight, in the autumn when you've got these very tall leaves, they are slightly more effective of intercepting light in the autumn. and again Lucy's work hinted at that. Also a question which has been raised, particularly after our experience in the frost, where you've got a variety with a very vigorous amount of growth around the crown, potentially protects the crown more from the frost. Now, we looked at this on one of our sites last year where we had the plots right through to the end of January, and there's no doubt about it, those varieties with that kind of more vigorous and larger number of petals tended to suffer less from the frost because there was just a bit more protection and they regrew slightly more effectively. So growth habit can have an effect, and I would urge you to have a look at the crops, how they grow on your farm, because growth habit can be affected by site and particularly soil type, and they can grow slightly differently. But it's worth categorising those varieties you have growing and understanding how you can capitalise on that. So just a comment, so we've got these two varieties, but they're kind of at both ends of the spectrum in a way. You've got 1915 and Wren there. Many of the other varieties actually kind of come somewhere in between, so bear that in mind. We call them intermediate varieties, and of course they get the best of both worlds in a way. So now let's look at some of the varieties on the 2024 list. BTS 1915 is probably the logical place to start. It's probably the most grown variety, and it's our highest yielding variety on the list, still coming in nearly 4% over the control average. A very strong variety. Remember, it mustn't be drilled early, and that's why it has that red cross against it. Must go in after the middle of March. Has a broadly good foliage rating. Let me just remind you of that system. If it's highly susceptible to disease, it'll have a score as low as 1 or 2. If it is a more resistance to foliar disease, it'll be up in 7 to 8, so a 1 to 9 scale. Sits in the middle of the pack, a broadly good foliar disease score. Very tall, very upright variety, and it has worked very well in situations where it's left for later harvesting. So Daphne is another well-established variety on the sugar beet RL list. Of course, Daphne brings in the BCN trait. Not only does the variety yield quite well in the presence of BCN compared to non-tolerant varieties, it also helps suppress the population. The PF-PI ratio, which is a measure of the final divided by the initial population, is lower in these varieties, so it helps keep population growth down. Again, it's still there, it's yielding well, has a nice sugar content, slightly lower growth habit, a little bit more prostrate, quite large leaves, does well, and again, good experience of this going on for late harvesting as well. So BTS 1140 again is a variety we've had with us for a number of years now, still yielding there or thereabouts and doing well. Again, a nice sugar content. We have some experience that actually it's probably best drilled after the middle of March. Whilst it doesn't have a particularly high number, we just know on experience that in some situations, some seasons, it is best left to late lift. And again, its disease rating is there or thereabouts. So again, good solid performer, quite an established variety in the UK. So getting to some of our newer varieties now. Now some of you may have grown Harrietta this season. Again, KWS variety coming in with a really good yield improvement, nice sugar content, can be drilled early as well. If you look at its disease rating, probably it's a little bit weak on rust, but it produces a really strong growing canopy, so it probably has some of the growing attributes for leaving for later harvesting, but just be mindful that it will need careful fungicide protection as well. So like Harrietta, Kajana, stablemate really. Both of these varieties have BCN traits. We have 4 on the RL list now, and you've seen Daphne already. Again, broadly similar to Harrietta, good yield performance, nice sugar content, and again a little bit weak on rust. You can see it there, nice strong going canopy, so it can be left for later harvesting, but that rust score means it just needs looking after with a good fungicide program the later you take it. So Anatina, again another KWS variety, again performing well compared to the controls, really nice sugar content. Its population a little bit lower, not significantly so, but it does sit at the lower end of the spectrum. But then this time, unlike Cacciana and Harrietta, it's got a much stronger foliar disease score again, so another possible candidate for leaving slightly later. And I guess any of these varieties, bear in mind Cortessa we have no longer, and that did do well at late harvest. These are possible varieties. You could look for that later slot, but just bear in mind the disease control and the fungicide requirement for Cajana and Harrietta. So this is a Cess van der Haaf's Wren variety, again characteristic from that kind of lower growing habit and really big leaves, very effective in attracting sunlight early in the season. Again, yielding very well compared to the control. Sugar a little bit on the lower side compared to some of the other varieties, but a really good emergence score, nearly 103% of the controls. Disease rating sits kind of middle-ish, powdery mildew a little bit below the average, but a really good solid variety. So one of the newer varieties from BTS is 3610. Again, kind of yielding there or thereabouts in line with the controls. Good sugar content, can be drilled early, good solid disease profile. A variety which can be grown in a number of situations, and certainly worth looking at. Now some varieties from Struber, and it's great to see them with an increasing presence on the RL list. Morgan, a good solid performing variety, but not to be drilled early. But otherwise, very much a good set of figures there. Certainly a variety worth having a look at. But sitting beside it is another Struber variety. This one brings the BCN trait, so that's our 4 now. Again, good set of figures, not dissimilar actually from Morgan, but obviously if you want the BCN trait, you've got that in button. BTS 3020, one of the more distinctive varieties, if you can see, has a very curly, a very wave leaf margin to it. Quite a light growing canopy, but quite upright. A good yield performance. Has the high sugar content of 17.5% on the list. And actually, when you look at its disease profile as well, has one of the highest scores for rust. It scores an 8.1, 5.2 for mildew, and a 7.2 for Cercospora. So a really good disease profile there. So definitely one I would consider for growing on for later harvesting. And some of the experience with this variety last year, it hung on really well to its canopy. Both recovered from drought and through frost as well, so it does seem to hold its canopy well. So Adder from Cess van der Haaf sitting there with steady yield performance again, and again just to remind you, this shouldn't be drilled early. It should be drilled after the middle of March, and a good set of values for disease control. So a good all-round performing variety. So one last variety before we look at some of the more specialised traits. This is Stuart again. This is from Struber. Again, good solid performer in terms of yield performance. Can be drilled early. Nice sugar content. Again, its rust rating is a little bit low on the score inside. Will need looking after. But again, slightly smaller variety. Doesn't always fully meet across the canopy, but a good strong variety. So now let's have a look at the 2 smart varieties. So this is ALS Conviso smart varieties on the list. Those of you who have been growing those varieties will be familiar with Rixter and Janinka. The technology is being licensed out to other breeders now. So BTS have brought their first variety onto the list, BTS Smart 9485. Now, just to remind you, when we grow these varieties in strips, they don't get the Conviso chemical. That will be too complicated and tempting fate when we've got a lot of susceptible varieties around us as well. I'm sure with their conventional chemistry, and they will yield slightly better than they do in the system where we're putting conventional chemistry onto them. But a good solid variety, we know it's a fantastic trait to have, particularly in situations where you've got weed beet. And I think where these varieties score, they're coming forward with a slightly better disease profile. Some of the older varieties were a little bit weaker on disease, so a good score there for rust, mildew and Cercospora. So as with all smart varieties, whilst they don't carry a red cross for not drilling before the middle of April, the general advice is to drill later to avoid bolters and obviously production of resistant weed beet. And that's the same for BTS Smart 9485 and of course the new one from AWS, which is Smart Vesnica. So one of the other traits, of course, we're working very hard on in BBRO is to bring some and identify some resistance to virus yellows or some tolerance to it. Marussia, of course, was brought to the RL list last year with some partial tolerance of mild virus, and certainly the work we've done seems to bear that out. It's a very dark green, strong growing variety. There is a bit of a yield lag in terms of bringing this trait to it, but all credit to KWS. It's a first generation variety of its type, and we know there's second and third generations on their way. Mustn't be drilled early, and otherwise it's a good sugar content. And for growers, perhaps particularly those who don't want to use Cruiser or also don't want to use a foliar insecticide, it would maybe give them an option, to use the variety strength here. A little bit weak on powdery mildew, but actually has one of the best Cercospora ratings of all the varieties on the list, would you believe? So which is interesting, we've got that trait in there as well. I'm sure that's something KWS are exploiting and bringing into some of their new varieties as well. So the 40 or so fields we have across the beet grown area which have the aggressive strain of AYPR, we always make sure we've got a variety to use on those lands. Felina's been with us for a number, so that's a KWS variety. It is becoming probably a little bit outperformed in terms of yield, can't be drilled early, and again it's probably a little bit weak on rust, so it's been great and it's on the list now, but I'm now going to introduce you to the new APYR variety. So the new AYPR variety is Osprey. It's a Cess van der Haaf variety, very distinctive, a very strong growing canopy in the field, good for early drilling, and a kind of good average score for its disease control, and a nice high plant population number as well. So not only does have AYPR, it's actually a very sound variety anyhow, one you may want to consider. Of course, don't forget all the detailed information is in the May edition of Beet Review and on the BBRO website. And of course, if you have any questions and discussion you want to have about for your variety choices, you know where we are at BBRO.